At sunrise, the Colosseum was already awake. Light slid down its arches like molten gold, glinting off stones still dark with yesterday's blood. The air was thick, smoke from early fires, sour wine, iron, sweat. Beneath the stands, handlers argued over cages, sharpening tools, trading curses that echoed through tunnels. Somewhere above, a vendor barked about olives and watered wine, his voice mixing with the distant growl of caged beasts. The gates had not yet opened, but Rome was already hungry. Hungry for what it called entertainment, and what history would later recognize as ritualized cruelty. But the games did not begin here, beneath this monumental shell of marble and iron. Their roots reached back centuries earlier, into the dirt of a cattle market, not the grandeur of an amphitheater. In 264 BC, long before the emperors and their spectacles, two sons prepared to honor their dead father, Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva. They could have built him a statue or offered incense at his tomb. Instead, they armed 3 pairs of slaves, marched them into the Forum Boarium, and ordered them to fight to the death. It was called a munus, literally, a duty. Not a sport, not a diversion. It was an offering ode to the departed, a way to ensure the spirit of the deceased crossed safely into the afterlife. The Romans had borrowed the custom from the Etruscans and the Campanians, who believed blood was the bridge between worlds. Warriors had once been slain beside their fallen chiefs, so they might serve them beyond death. But as centuries passed, human sacrifice softened into combat, killing replaced by contest. It was still death, but now it had rhythm, form, and audience. The crowd gathered not for laughter, but reverence. Yet reverence was a fragile thing in Rome, it decayed easily into fascination. That first funeral duel, held among the stench of livestock and smoke, awakened something primal in the Roman imagination. It was not merely the courage of the dying that stirred them, but the sight of blood drawn publicly, sanctioned, ritualized, justified. The funeral games were meant to honor one man, but they ended up celebrating something far larger, the idea that violence could serve order. Within a few generations, the munera evolved. Wealthy families turned grief into performance. To bury a man with treasures showed wealth, to bury him with a spectacle proved power. As the Republic expanded, so did the appetite for showmanship. The elite realized that these combats could do more than appease ancestors, they could impress the living. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's magistrates began to stage public combats during religious festivals. The Senate approved them as offerings to Jupiter, framing them as piety. But the crowds were not fooled. They understood what the games had become, a tool for control, a theater of obedience. The Republic had discovered a formula that would endure for centuries. Keep the people entertained, and they will not rebel. Even the weapons and armor carried their own political language. Early gladiators were made to resemble the peoples Rome had conquered. The Samnite with his broad shield and heavy helmet, the Thracian with curved blade and small round buckler, the Gaul with his long sword and naked fury. To watch them fight was to watch Rome's victories replayed again and again. Each kill was a reminder of empire, of discipline, of domination. Every drop of blood whispered the same message: Rome ruled not only the world, but the meaning of life and death itself. Wooden stands gave way to stone amphitheaters, and private funerals gave way to public festivals. The spectacle became too large to belong to any one family. It became a property of the state. Senators began to sponsor games to win favor, generals funded them to celebrate victories, emperors expanded them to display divine authority. And the citizens, oh, the citizens, they learned to cheer. Children grew up on the sound of death disguised as glory. Parents explained the rules of combat as if they were teaching morality. The sand became a teacher, the arena a classroom. Rome was not merely training soldiers, it was training spectators. To shout at slaughter, to laugh at agony, to applaud the fall of a man who moments ago had breathed and prayed, these became civic duties. What began as a sacred debt to the dead transformed into a public addiction. By the time the Republic's politics began to crumble under ambition and corruption, the people's loyalties no longer belonged to the Senate or the gods. They belonged to the games. To the promise that as long as the sands turned red, life outside could be tolerated. The Roman philosopher Cicero would later call the spectacles the shadow of war, useful to harden the spirit. But what they hardened was not courage, it was indifference. As historian Livy wrote of those early centuries, the Roman heart learned to find beauty in the screams of men. And yet, it was also methodical. Nothing in Rome happened by accident. The games were not born from chaos, but from policy. They shaped identity, enforced hierarchy, and reminded every citizen that mercy belonged only to those who ruled. By the 1st century BC, temporary wooden arenas had spread across Italy, drawing crowds by the tens of thousands. Beneath the banners of Jupiter and Mars, men bled to keep the Republic united through fear and fascination. The munus, once an intimate farewell, had become a language of power. It is strange to think how quietly the transformation occurred. No decree announced it. No philosopher named it. Death simply moved from graveyards to grandstands, and the people followed. The funerals that once honored ancestors now honored empire. When the first stone amphitheaters rose, they were not built as temples to the gods, but temples to control. The curve of the seating, the symmetry of the walls, the precision of the entrances, all designed to make the viewer feel both small and significant, awed and obedient. The architecture of spectacle was the architecture of submission. By then, Rome had forgotten that the games were ever about the dead. The spirits of the departed no longer needed appeasement. The living did. The empire had found a new way to feed the restless soul of the crowd, not with bread, not with faith, but with blood. The transformation was complete. What began as a ritual of mourning had become a machine of power. Rome no longer just conquered nations. It conquered the human capacity for compassion. And in that conquest, the empire discovered a new kind of weapon: control over the meaning of death itself. When Julius Caesar returned from his conquests in 46 BC, he wanted Rome to remember not just his victories, but the scale of them. So he built a new kind of spectacle. In the heart of the city, beneath garlands and banners, he paraded an animal no Roman had ever seen before, a giraffe. The crowd gasped. Some thought it was a trick, half camel, half leopard, so strange they named it Camelopardalis. Caesar smiled. And when the astonishment peaked, he gave the signal. The animal was herded into the arena and slaughtered. It wasn't science or curiosity that moved the crowd, it was awe. The message was unmistakable. If Caesar could capture a creature from the edge of the known world, there was nothing beyond Rome's reach. In that moment, spectacle became politics, and cruelty became proof of empire. Soon, exotic beasts became as vital to Roman entertainment as gladiators. They called the shows venations, hunts. But these were not contests of survival. They were orchestrations of annihilation. Caravans rumbled from the farthest provinces, North Africa, the Caucasus, even India. They carried lions, tigers, leopards, elephants, crocodiles, ostriches, and bears, all destined for the sand. It was said that one caravan of camels once stretched 10 miles long, each wagon carrying a cage, each cage carrying a creature that would never see its homeland again. The logistics alone were staggering. Capturing a lion alive required entire teams of hunters, nets, spears, and immense risk. Transporting it meant feeding it for weeks across deserts where men died of thirst. And when the beasts reached the city, they were starved deliberately, to make them wild enough for the crowd's appetite. Their cages were built just beneath the seats, so citizens could hear the growls before the gate rose. The sound was part of the show. By the time the Colosseum opened in AD 80 under Emperor Titus, Rome's appetite had turned monstrous. That inaugural festival lasted 100 days, and according to ancient writers, more than 9,000 animals died before the games ended. Lions with ribs like daggers, elephants crippled from transport, leopards pacing themselves mad, all driven into the light to die in front of 50,000 cheering souls. Some were pitted against gladiators, others against each other. Occasionally, a condemned man was thrown in among them, dressed as a hunter but armed with nothing. The crowd laughed at his terror, because laughter was easier than empathy. The killing was constant, so constant that ancient sources mention the sand had to be replaced repeatedly, soaked black with blood. What Rome built was not merely an arena, it was an ecosystem of cruelty. Every show required months of preparation: hunting expeditions in Africa, fleets sailing down the Nile, traders bribed in Parthia, handlers trained to control beasts that could crush them. It was an industry, an economy of death that stretched from the deserts of Libya to the forests of Germania. Behind the glamour, there was misery. The slaves who cleaned the cages rarely lived long. Bites, infections, fevers, all common, all forgotten. Their graves lay unmarked beyond the city walls, but their labor made the empire's illusion of dominion possible. The hunts themselves followed ritual order. First came the display, the cages wheeled in, the gates rising, the animals emerging into light for the first time in weeks. Then came the chase, archers, hunters, or condemned criminals released to run. And finally, the slaughter. Spears flew, nets tangled, blood sprayed across the stands as the crowd roared for more. To the Romans, this was not cruelty, it was proof of greatness. Each exotic kill symbolized a conquered land. A leopard from the east was a map of Asia stained red. An elephant from Carthage was vengeance for Hannibal's war. Every corpse on the sand was a message: Rome conquers not only men, but nature itself. Yet not everyone cheered. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, warned that the empire's appetite for spectacle was devouring the natural world. He recorded how lions vanished from regions that once teemed with them, how elephants became scarce near the Red Sea, how leopards disappeared from Syria. Rome's games had begun to rewrite the geography of life. Still, emperors competed to outdo one another. If Caesar introduced the giraffe, others would stage entire menageries. Emperor Pompey boasted of killing 600 lions in one festival. Augustus, more measured, imported crocodiles from Egypt to display his dominion over the Nile. Titus ordered rhinoceroses, hippos, even bears from the Alps. The beasts became political trophies, living symbols of provinces subdued, now made to die for applause. Then came Commodus, the emperor who turned the games into a mirror of his vanity. Dressed as Hercules, he strode into the arena himself, wielding a club and bow. The crowd roared, though not from admiration, from fear. Everyone knew the hunts were staged. The lions were chained, the bears half-blind, the ostriches crippled. Commodus would strike from a safe distance, then pose as the god of strength. Once, he decapitated an ostrich, waved its bloody head toward the senators in the stands, and grinned. They understood the warning. Laughter could be misread as mockery, silence as defiance. Applause was the only safe response. For Commodus, the arena was not about spectacle, it was about dominance. He hunted not beasts but submission. To defy him was to become part of the show. But even as emperors bathed in this false glory, something irreversible was happening. The empire was running out of animals. After centuries of slaughter, whole species disappeared from the Mediterranean world. Lions vanished from Greece. Elephants grew rare in North Africa. In the eastern provinces, hunters sold snakeskins and feathers in place of live beasts. Rome had consumed nature faster than it could replace it. And yet the crowds still demanded more. More blood. More novelty. More proof that the empire's reach was infinite. The Colosseum became the mouth of a beast that could never be fed. If you stood in its shadow then, you would have seen the logic that ruled the empire, a system that measured power by how loudly the weak could scream. It was not about survival. It was about message, that even the wild bowed to Rome. Each roar silenced the possibility of mercy. Each kill reminded the world that life itself had become imperial property. The hunts that once celebrated conquest now devoured the very world Rome claimed to rule. By midday, when the morning's duels had drained the crowd's first hunger for blood, the arena transformed. Shadows grew shorter, the sun fell directly overhead, and the sand, soaked with sweat, oil and life, was raked smooth once more. The air was thick and stifling, yet no one left their seats. They knew what came next. The morning was for warriors, the afternoon was for the condemned. From beneath the stands, the first prisoners were brought up in chains. Men, women, even children, rebels, thieves, deserters, Christians, slaves who had defied their masters. They were not called victims, nor criminals, but actors. For what followed was not justice. It was theater. Rome called this damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Each execution was a script, a performance written in advance and staged with the precision of art. Every punishment matched its crime. A thief might be torn apart by wolves. An arsonist, burned alive before the crowd. A traitor, devoured by lions. And the audience, thousands of Roman citizens, shouted approval as if watching a tragedy performed by professionals. The condemned were costumed for the parts assigned to them. Some were dressed as mythological heroes. Others as villains from Rome's oldest legends. The irony was deliberate. A slave who had defied his master might be cast as Prometheus, bound to the rock as vultures circled. An adulterer could be forced to play the role of Paris, condemned for desiring the wrong woman. In one infamous case recorded by the poet Martial, a man was dressed as Orpheus, the musician who charmed beasts with his song. But when he began to play his lyre, a hidden gate opened and a bear lunged forward, mauling him to death. The crowd cheered, delighted at the realism. This was the genius and horror of Rome, the merging of myth and murder. Every death was a reenactment of Rome's legends, every corpse a prop in its grand narrative. The empire didn't just conquer nations, it conquered meaning itself. Engineers designed the Colosseum to make such fantasies possible. Beneath the sand lay a labyrinth of wooden elevators, pulleys, and hidden corridors. With a single signal, a trapdoor could open and release a lion from below, or flood the arena with water for a mock sea battle. Fireworks, smoke, and thunderous sound effects. Rome had invented the first special effects industry, powered by human agony. When the Colosseum's channels were flooded, the show shifted to naumachii, mock naval battles. Real ships, manned by prisoners, clashed in the water while the crowd watched from dry seats. These men knew they would never leave alive. When Emperor Claudius staged his grandest sea fight, thousands of captives saluted him with the words history would never forget. Ave, Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. To the spectators, these words were thrilling. To the condemned, they were prayer. Fire was another favorite spectacle. Condemned men were wrapped in tunics soaked with pitch and oil, tunica molesta, the painful shirt, and set ablaze to illuminate the evening games. The poet Tertullian called them living torches. Vendors sold wine beneath their burning bodies. Children pointed, laughed, and mimicked their screams. Rome had turned cruelty into a lullaby. Sometimes, the executions grew so elaborate they bordered on surreal. An emperor might order an entire myth, acted out to its fatal end. In one show, a man was suspended with wax wings as deadless, attempting to fly. The mechanism failed, and he plunged to the beasts below. In another, a woman was forced to play Pasiphae, the queen cursed to desire a bull. A mechanical beast was brought in, and her humiliation became the crowd's entertainment. Each horror carried a moral lesson twisted for control. Disobey Rome and you will die, not as yourself, but as a parody. Yet not everyone in those marble stands was blind. The philosopher Seneca wrote with disgust that watching executions taught cruelty, not discipline. He confessed he could no longer stomach the midday spectacles, where men died for laughter. Each death, he warned, kills something inside the living. But his words were swallowed by the roar of the mob. For most Romans, violence had become invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was everywhere. The games ran like a civic heartbeat, pulsing through daily life. A child might play with toy swords in the morning, then watch real death at noon. A merchant might sell bread outside the arena while slaves screamed within. Even funerals sometimes echoed the arena's language. The dead were described as honored like gladiators. Rome had normalized cruelty so thoroughly that compassion was seen as weakness. To show pity for a condemned man could draw suspicion. To turn away from the arena might be viewed as unpatriotic. The empire didn't need to demand obedience, it bred it. Still, there were cracks in the facade. Early Christians, refusing to worship Rome's gods, were thrown to beasts before chanting crowds. But their calmness, their prayers as the lions closed in, left a strange silence in their wake. For the first time, the audience witnessed people who did not beg, who did not scream, who looked beyond the emperor and saw something higher. Some historians say those moments planted seeds of doubt, tiny fractures in the empire's soul that would one day split it apart. But in those centuries, doubt was drowned by applause. The games were too vast, too ingrained, too beloved to stop. The Colosseum had become the empire's heartbeat, loud, rhythmic, merciless. As dusk fell and torches flickered to life, the crowd often lingered, basking in the afterglow of violence. The smell of smoke, blood, and hot oil clung to their clothes. Vendors called out final sales. Somewhere below, slaves scrubbed the sand clean for the next day's show. And when the gates finally shut, Rome slept soundly, comforted by the illusion that the world was in order, that justice had been done, that the gods were pleased. But the truth was darker. Every beast killed, every body burned, every scream applauded had drawn Rome one step closer to its own doom. Because when a civilization begins to mistake cruelty for entertainment, it has already started to write the script of its own demise. By the late 1st century, the line between ruler and performer had vanished. The emperors of Rome no longer governed from palaces, they ruled from the stage. Power was no longer proven by victory in war or wisdom in law, but by how spectacularly one could orchestrate death. Caligula began the descent. When he ran out of animals for the arena, he simply ordered spectators dragged from the stands and thrown in instead. They came to watch carnage and became part of it. His successor, Nero, turned execution into art. He called himself an actor of tragedy and demanded that prisoners be killed in ways that matched the scenes of his favorite plays. When the victims screamed on cue, Nero smiled, claiming their agony was proof of authenticity. By the time Commodus took the throne, the emperor no longer pretended. He was the show. Cloaked in a lion's pelt, wielding a club like Hercules reborn, Commodus marched into the Colosseum as both god and gladiator. The crowd was ordered to cheer as he hunted crippled animals, each chained to ensure his triumph. He fought men too, but only those whose swords were dulled or whose armor was rigged to shatter. It was theater without suspense. Only terror. The senators sat frozen, clapping with trembling hands. They knew that applause had become a survival skill. Commodus even demanded the treasury pay him for each of his appearances, bankrupting the empire one performance at a time. Rome had built an empire on spectacle, and now spectacle ruled it. But beyond the marble seats, the voices of dissent were growing. Philosophers, poets, and even a few senators began to whisper that the games had poisoned the soul of the empire. Cicero, a century before, had admired the courage of gladiators but warned that cruelty for pleasure corrupted virtue. Seneca wrote that the midday shows have become bloodier than war, lamenting that Romans no longer pitted suffering, they purchased it. And then came the Christians. To them, the amphitheater was both persecution and revelation. Men and women who refused to worship the emperor were thrown to beasts, burned alive, or crucified in the sand. Yet many faced death with calm. They prayed instead of pleading, forgave instead of cursing. Their defiance unsettled the crowd more than any roar of lions. It was the first time Rome's theater of death failed to entertain. The historian Tertullian called the arena the seedbed of cruelty. He wrote that each cheer, each laugh, planted another root of evil in the Roman heart. For him, those who delighted in suffering were already condemned, not by the state, but by their own nature. Still, the games continued. Emperor Trajan celebrated his victories in Dacia with 103 days of games, thousands of men and beasts slaughtered in the name of peace. To the Romans, it was a spectacle of triumph. To history, it was exhaustion disguised as glory. By the 3rd century, the empire was rotting from within. The cost of spectacle was crushing. Feeding, housing, and transporting thousands of beasts and prisoners drained treasuries already bled by wars. Provinces starved while Rome still demanded festivals. When emperors could no longer fund the games, they borrowed, taxed, and stole. What had once been a show of strength became a symptom of decay. The poet Juvenal, bitter and brilliant, captured the truth in 2 words that would echo through centuries: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. He meant that Rome had traded its soul for comfort and distraction. As long as the people had food and entertainment, they would not care who ruled them. The games no longer united Rome, they dulled it. And when the empire began to crumble, the arenas fell silent. The great Colosseum, once a roaring heart of life and death, stood hollow. Grass grew over the sand where thousands had bled. Birds nested in the marble cracks. The echo of the crowd faded into wind. By the 5th century, the spectacles had ceased. Christianity had outlawed them, calling them pagan and obscene. But the silence came too late to save Rome. The empire that had once commanded the world had consumed itself, just as it had consumed its victims. The spectacles that promised eternity had hastened its end. A civilization that glorifies suffering cannot sustain compassion, and without compassion, no empire can stand. Today, tourists walk through the Colosseum's ruins, cameras in hand. They marvel at the architecture, at the genius of its design, the corridors, the gates, the seats, the bones of the empire's grandeur. But if you stand there long enough, beneath the arches where sunlight meets shadow, you can almost hear it. The distant echo of the crowd, the crack of whips, the low growl of caged beasts waiting in the dark. The stone remembers. It remembers the trembling of the condemned, the laughter of the spectators, the rumble of the drums before the gates opened. It remembers the cruelty that once called itself culture, the control that once called itself civilization. The Colosseum stands not as a monument to Rome's greatness, but as a warning carved into eternity. It whispers a truth every generation must face, that when power learns to dress cruelty as entertainment, when people learn to cheer what they should mourn, when applause drowns out conscience, then even the mightiest empire begins to die long before its fall. The arena may be quiet now, but its lesson is not. Because every time we revel in another's pain, every time we mistake spectacle for justice, or power for virtue, we step back into those stands and raise our hands once more. Rome's stones are not silent. They are mirrors. And when you look into them, they look back.